On January 5, 1942, as exultant shouts of victory echoed through the streets of Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto instructed the staff of the Imperial Combined Fleet to begin preparing the second stage of operations in the Pacific War. His study of the situation, supported by reports from the Philippines, Malaya, and other southern fronts, indicated that within a few months, Japanese forces would control East Asia and the additional territories struck during the December offensives. Yamamoto told his chief of staff, Motome Ugaki, that he wanted detailed operational plans completed by mid-February. The speed with which the Japanese armed forces had conquered the Western Pacific stunned Tokyo's planners and triggered sharp disagreement within the Imperial General Staff. A divided Japanese High Command One faction, composed of ardent military nationalists, wanted to push the advance as far as possible so long as victory continued. They cared little about distance, strategy, or long-term risk. Another faction, represented by Admiral Yamamoto, had been deeply reluctant to enter a war against the United States and Britain in the first place. They worried about Japan's long-term future. One reason Yamamoto was at sea aboard the Combined Fleet flagship Yamato was that friends on the general staff feared he would be assassinated if he remained in Tokyo because of his outspoken opposition to an unlimited war. Even now, his concerns were no secret. Ugaki recorded in his diary Yamamoto's warnings about the need for far-sighted statesmanship following the first month of glorious victories, words Yamamoto often repeated to emphasize that Japan could not defeat the Western powers in a prolonged war. Yamamoto's criticism was aimed at figures such as Prince Konoe and others who, in his view, did not understand what kind of war Japan was entering. Yamamoto's private warnings before Pearl Harbor. 3 months before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto met a friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa, president of the ultranationalist Kokusuikai organization, at the Imperial Navy Club in Shiba. Yamamoto warned that war had become inevitable because of the politicians' decisions. At first, he said, we will have everything our own way, stretching out like an octopus spreading its tentacles. But only a month after the war began, that octopus already lay spread almost flat. He warned Sasakawa that the euphoria would not last. The moment for political action, he said, would be when Singapore fell. Its collapse would shake the British position in India, and London might then be willing to negotiate. Yamamoto knew the British well. He had attended the London naval conferences of 1930 and 1934. He knew the Americans even better, having served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. Once war began, he believed Japan had 18 months at most to secure a favorable peace. We must obtain a peace agreement by then, he told Sasakawa, urging him to share the warning with right-wing leaders in power. Early Japanese triumphs and their limits. By January 5th, the situation seemed promising for Tokyo. The American battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor had been crippled. The British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales were sunk off Malaya. Manila and the U.S. naval base at Cavite had fallen. Hong Kong had surrendered. Japanese troops were advancing into the Dutch East Indies, Rabaul, Ambon, and the Solomon Islands. But Yamamoto saw what others missed. The American aircraft carriers had escaped at Pearl Harbor, and they remained a constant threat. He needed a spectacular, decisive victory. Singapore, he believed, would not fall for 5 or 6 months. It actually fell on February 15th, so he had to strike elsewhere. Where to strike next? The army vetoed Yamamoto's proposal to attack the Soviet Union. Japan's land forces were already overextended in China and Southeast Asia. 3 alternative strategies emerged. 1. Yamamoto's plan: strike into the Indian Ocean, invade Ceylon, Sri Lanka, draw out and destroy the British Far Eastern Fleet, push toward the Middle East, link with German forces driving into the Caucasus, secure access to vital oil fields. The Army rejected this plan outright. 2. The Naval General Staff's plan: attack Australia. Take the Solomons, New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji, Samoa, then isolate Australia and deprive the Americans of a forward base. Yamamoto disliked this plan. It would take too long and would not produce the dramatic victory needed to force negotiation. 3. Yamamoto's final plan, the Midway and Aleutians operations. In January, he ordered a new operational outline. 2 months later, his officers submitted the MI plan: lure the American carriers into a decisive battle near Midway, destroy them, and eliminate U.S. naval power in the Pacific. The AL plan: invade the Aleutians, then push toward Alaska's mainland. If all went perfectly, Japan would later seize Hawaii, and potentially even the U.S. West Coast. If MI and AL succeeded, Japan could finally offer a peace agreement from a position of strength. Although admirals in Tokyo debated fiercely, Yamamoto ultimately prevailed. A critical turning point ignored. Ironically, the fall of Singapore in February and the impending collapse of Bataan and Corregidor, events Yamamoto had anticipated as moments for political leverage, were now overshadowed by an unexpected shock: Colonel James Doolittle's B-25 raid on Tokyo, April 1942. The Doolittle Raid electrified the Japanese public and leadership, proving the Americans were only beginning their fight. It also shook Yamamoto. The U.S. still had offensive reach. After the catastrophic Midway defeat in June, carefully concealed from the Japanese army, there was no time for recrimination. While Yamamoto was at sea, the Naval General Staff continued moving forces southward to threaten New Guinea and Australia. The South Pacific front begins to shift. By early 1942, Japanese troops had taken Rabaul, January 23rd. Air reconnaissance and raids struck New Guinea and adjacent islands. The Allies feared Japan would soon capture Port Moresby and use New Guinea as a springboard into northern Australia. The Japanese bombed Darwin in February and attacked Salamaua in March. A major push toward Port Moresby was stopped only by the Battle of the Coral Sea, where American and Australian forces halted the Japanese invasion fleet. Still, Japanese forces occupied Tulagi, north of Guadalcanal, and built a seaplane base, one that would soon become central in the coming battle for control of the South Pacific. The causeway that linked the two small islands had become the Marines' lifeline. Reinforcements were ordered to Tanambogo, and at dusk, the assaulting unit received 5 minutes of preparatory naval bombardment. Unfortunately, one of the final shells struck a fuel dump near the beach, igniting it and illuminating the entire shoreline as brightly as midday. As the Marines advanced, the Japanese could see them perfectly silhouetted against the sea. Machine gun and rifle fire poured down from dugouts on the hills. 2 boatloads of Marines managed to reach the beach, but the coxswain of the third boat was killed at his tiller. The craft veered wildly out of control and drifted back to sea. The following landing craft, thinking orders had changed, also turned away. The result was disastrous. The men from the 2 boats ashore were stranded, their only protection a concrete pier. When they returned fire, their tracers revealed their exact position. Several men went down, 1 boat withdrew with the wounded, and confusion reigned before the remaining boats finally reorganized and resumed landing. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched a counterattack against the beach. Captain Crane, commander of the stranded unit, was cut off from his boat. He and 5 Marines, hid in the brush and under cover of darkness, slipped back to the shoreline after the Japanese withdrew to their hillside positions. They were eventually rescued, but not until 4 a.m. on August 8th, when another Marine unit finally secured the causeway. When the fighting began, there were roughly 500 Japanese soldiers on the connected islands of Gavutu and Tanambogo. When it ended, none were left alive. Japan's shock at Tulagi, August 7, 1942. Early on the morning of August 7th, the Tulagi radio station transmitted the first alarm of the American landings to Rabaul. The shocking report reached Rabaul airfield just as Japanese pilots were preparing for their daily operations against Australian positions in New Guinea. Their mission was canceled immediately. All available planes were ordered to strike the American invasion fleet. Before the aircraft could take off, worse news arrived from Tulagi. The entire flying boat flotilla had been destroyed. Moments later, communications with Tulagi went silent, proof that the base had been overrun. At 8:30 a.m., a flight of 27 twin-engine Betty bombers departed Rabaul. Loaded with bombs for their originally planned New Guinea strike, they carried no torpedoes. They were escorted by 18 Zero fighters as they climbed to 13,000 feet, flew east to Bougainville, then turned south along the coast of Banica. Shortly after 1 p.m., 4 F-4F Wildcats from the USS Enterprise sighted the formation. The Wildcats, flying at 18,000 feet, dove on the bombers near Florida Island. Lieutenant V.P. Dies shot down one Betty, and 4 others trailed smoke as probables. But once the Zeros joined the fight, the outnumbered Wildcats broke away into cloud cover as instructed. One Wildcat was shot down, and Dies' aircraft was so badly damaged that he barely managed an emergency landing on the USS Wasp. A second division of 6 Enterprise Wildcats, led by Lieutenant G.E. Firebaugh, intercepted the Japanese off Santa Isabel Island. 10 Zeros rushed in, attacking 3 of the Wildcats, shooting all 3 down. The remaining American fighters pressed an attack on the bombers, with radio man T.W. Rhodes scoring the first confirmed kill of a Zero. But soon, the full weight of the Japanese fighter escort overwhelmed them. Firebaugh, W.S. Stevenson Jr., and W.H. Warden were all shot down. A coastwatcher later rescued Firebaugh. Warden was saved by a canoe from another coastwatcher station. Stevenson was never found. Other carrier pilots fared no better. 6 Wildcats of Flight 323 encountered more bombers near Lunga Point, shooting down 4. Machinist Darunin destroyed 2 on his own. But coastwatchers sound the alarm. At 2:30 p.m., as the bombers and Zeros began their run over the islands, coastwatchers were already at work. Paul Edward Mason, a former copra planter stationed on Malab Hill overlooking Buin, radioed that 24 bombers were headed for Guadalcanal. The enemy was still 2¼ hours away when his message was relayed from Pearl Harbor to the invasion fleet. The Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra responded with calm precision. When the message arrived, the boatswain piped over the loudspeaker. "The ship will be attacked at noon by 24 torpedo bombers. All hands will pipe to dinner at 11:00 rad." Right on schedule, the torpedo bombers arrived. American fighters climbed to 20,000 feet as the bombers crossed Guadalcanal's north shore at noon. Ships and planes were ready. For the first time in the South Pacific, the Japanese encountered a prepared American counterattack. Of the 24 Betty bombers, 23 were shot down. Only the destroyer USS Mugford suffered a bomb hit. Against the Zeros, however, the Americans fared worse. Japan had sent its elite pilots, among them Saburo Sakai, Japan's top ace. He and his unit were stunned that American carriers had survived Midway. They had been told all U.S. carriers were destroyed. The Wildcats attacked aggressively, but scattered after their initial dives, aware they could not match the Zero in turning or rate of climb. During the brutal fight, Sakai shot down 1 Wildcat and an SBD dive bomber. But when he mistook another group of SBDs for fighters, he flew directly into 4 rear gunners who riddled his Zero and wounded him severely. Somehow, he managed to return to Rabaul before collapsing. The Zero still outclassed the Wildcat in maneuverability and speed, but American pilots were already discovering how to fight it. First day outcome. By nightfall on August 7th, the American invasion appeared secure. U.S. troops had advanced near the airfield, soon to be named Henderson Field. Captured prisoners indicated only about 600 combat troops and 1,400 laborers were on Guadalcanal. More than 11,000 Marines were ashore. Supplies were piling up faster than the beach parties could organize them. General Vandegrift was uneasy. The ease of the initial advance felt deceptive, but he continued landing supplies, aware the carriers would soon withdraw. August 8th, renewed Japanese attacks. At 8:40 a.m., coastwatcher Jack Red at Buka Passage spotted 45 Japanese dive bombers heading for Guadalcanal. Pearl Harbor relayed the warning. Carrier fighters intercepted many of them, but one blazing bomber crashed into the transport George F. Elliott, setting her aflame. Another bomber's torpedo crippled the destroyer USS Jarvis. By nightfall, the Marines had seized Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambago at heavy cost. Tulagi, 90 Marine casualties. Of 250 Japanese defenders, 200 killed, 3 captured, the rest swam to Florida Island. Gavutu, Tanambago, 250 Marine casualties, entire 500-man Japanese garrison wiped out. The ferocity of the Tulagi fighting contrasted sharply with the ease of the Guadalcanal landings. Yet, as Marines joked contemptuously about the enemy running away, their officers were increasingly uneasy. It had been too easy, and they knew that meant the storm was coming. Fletcher withdraws, and disaster approaches. Admiral Fletcher, shaken by losing 21 of his 99 carrier planes on the first day, radioed Admiral Gormley at 6 p.m. on August 8th, asking permission to withdraw the carriers. He withdrew before receiving an answer. Admiral Turner, upon intercepting Fletcher's message, realized with horror that he would be left without air cover just as Japanese air power in the region was increasing. And indeed, Japan was already reacting. The Japanese countermoves and a coming night battle. When the invasion alert reached Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet, reacted instantly. He loaded 6 transports with reinforcements and dispatched them with destroyer escort. But the submarine USS S-38, operating out of Australia, intercepted the convoy and sank the Mayo Maru, killing 342 soldiers. Recognizing the danger, Mikawa recalled the remaining transports, but he already had a powerful naval force en route. Early on August 7th, 5 heavy cruisers had left Kavieng on New Ireland. Mikawa diverted them all toward Rabaul, then personally boarded the cruiser Chokai and headed south with 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 1 destroyer. He intended to strike the Americans at night when Japanese naval doctrine dominated and American night fighting skills were notoriously poor. His plan was simple: arrive after midnight on August 8-9, surprise the enemy, and massacre the invasion fleet. The Americans had no idea he was coming. A failure of Allied reconnaissance, U.S. reconnaissance, depended on long-range B-17s of General MacArthur, Australian Army Air Force, Admiral McCain's land-based Navy air units, PBY flying boats, and, occasionally, coast watchers. But on August 8th, the most obvious route for a Japanese naval attack through the narrow west-to-east channel between the islands was left completely unsearched. The infamous stretch of water would soon earn a name: the Slot. Admiral Turner requested a special search of the Slot for August 8th, but his message was lost somewhere between Admiral McCain's headquarters and the seaplane tender USS Mackinac. No search was ever flown. Thus, on the night of August 8th, the most dangerous approach to Guadalcanal lay wide open.